Now, when I think of text, and speaking of that, I love how evaluating our world and how it's changed. And you can think of the last 5-10 years. There's one thing in particular that I find interesting is that if you've set up an appointment with somebody, let's say you're meeting somebody for coffee at 10 o'clock at a certain location. If you're going to be 2 minutes late, there's the expectation that you let them know that you're going to be late, that you need to send a text or something like that. And I just find that interesting because 10, 15, 20 years ago, we couldn't even do that. We didn't have the ability to communicate in such speed and such quickness. And it just shows how our world has changed, how things keep moving into one direction, and how maybe it's an instant gratification issue, but we just have so much at our fingertips today that's different than how the world has been throughout all of history. But the world is moving towards a specific place, and I don't think text messaging makes or breaks where the world is moving. God can use it, and he's not hindered by it. But when we look at Jesus, we see that Jesus has brought a proclamation. And that proclamation revolves around this concept of the kingdom of heaven. Now, the Old Testament laid some framework, laid some foundation for what Jesus was doing. Because you remember the Old Testament, we have the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And that God of the Old Testament is the same God in the New Testament and is the same God today. And so God is working out his plans in the world. And I mentioned that today, connecting the Old Testament to the New Testament to today, because Jesus was a Jew. When Jesus was born, he was born to Jewish parents. He was raised in Jewish culture and Jewish practices, and that is the context in which he lived. And as he was living and then eventually ministering, he had an eschatological proclamation, the end-time proclamation, and that was that the kingdom of heaven is here. Through the birth of Jesus, the kingdom of heaven was ushered into this world. But one of the things about what Jesus is doing is he doesn't give a specific timetable. He doesn't say you have this much time until this will happen. And so particularly when we look at the Gospel of Matthew, we find that the call to discipleship is now. It's immediate. You can't wait. You can't delay it. You need to act now because the kingdom of heaven is here now. And so the theological term to describe this is called a realized eschatology. So eschatology is the study of the end. Realize is that it's happening now. So that the end is here, is what Jesus is proclaiming. That we can begin to experience the blessings that Jesus has, his forgiveness, his grace, his love. We can begin to experience it now, but there is more to come. So I keep talking about the kingdom of heaven. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, the kingdom of heaven is the rule and reign of God. It's not a geographical location. You know, we think about the powers of this world, how a nation has geographical boundaries. The kingdom of heaven is not geographically bound. It's not culturally bound. It's not even language bound. It is all places at all times for those who wish to enter it. That is what Jesus invites us to. He calls us to enter it now. Now, your goal is not just to live the most morally superior life. That's not what Jesus is calling you to do. He's not calling you just to live better than everybody else or live to a certain moral code. He's calling you to enter the work that he has started. He's called you to usher in the redemption that he is bringing. Jesus is the Redeemer, the Restorer. Now, he's also called the Judge. He's also the one who will judge the world, but he wants to redeem and to restore. If you're familiar with the Apostles' Creed, the section about Jesus ends, it says that Jesus, he ascended to heaven and he sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. And from thenceforth, he shall come to judge the living and the dead. But Jesus didn't come just to judge us. He came to save us. He came to free us, to reconcile us to God. And so Jesus died on the cross. And he, Jesus, is the goal of history. He is where God's redemptive purposes have been moving to since sin in the world. In Genesis chapter 3, God prophesied about Jesus, and Jesus is the fulfillment of the redemption that God has promised. But one of the things that Jesus is really trying to do, if we would allow him, he's reconciling us to God. But what that means is he brings us back into communion with God. If you remember the garden in Genesis 1 and 2, Adam and Eve walked with God in the garden. That's what Jesus wants to restore. He wants to restore our communion with God so that we can be back with him and walk with him. And so maybe some of you are familiar with the hymn, probably depending on your age, in the garden. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry. I love the word tarry, because it means we're not going to have to rush. We're not going to have to rush through it. We're going to just be able to bask in the presence of God. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. That is what Jesus is trying to restore. It's a matter of us allowing him. It's a matter of us submitting to him and coming to him. But Jesus knows that the end is coming, that the timetable is not specific in the fact that we don't have the actual amount of time. So he tells us in Matthew chapter 24 about what's going to happen at the end. The disciples that say, Lord, tell us what will happen before you come. And he says there are going to be wars and rumors of wars. There's going to be earthquakes. There's going to be famine. There's going to be apostasy. There's going to be persecution. There's going to be people who claim to be me but don't trust them. And then he gets to verse 36 in Matthew chapter 24. He says, however, no one knows the day or the hour these things will happen. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son himself. Only the Father knows. That's very important for us to recognize. We don't know the time when this will happen. Now, we can look at the Old Testament, and we can see all the prophecies that they have in there. And there's a temptation for us to try to neatly fit these prophecies into modern times and say, well, this is what the prophecy said, and this is how it fits with our world today. And maybe that's right. But when we get to prophecies, we have to be careful not to put God in a box. That we don't say, well, I have great wisdom and I can discern exactly what God's message is, and there's no other possible explanation. We can see how prophecies are continuing to be revised in their understanding in modern context. And I think Jesus is a real prime example for this. Before Jesus came, the Jews had this concept of the Messiah, of what the Messiah was going to be. And they thought the Messiah was going to be this warrior king who would lead them back to prominence, that this Messiah would overthrow one human government only to establish another human government. Well, that's not what Jesus came to do. Jesus didn't come just to establish another human government. He came to upend the entire world. He came to usher in the kingdom of heaven, not just to have a geographical location on the map that God can call his own. He called to reclaim the entire world for God. And so the New Testament shows that Jesus has fulfilled these prophecies. And that's really important for us to say it that way. The New Testament shows that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies. Jesus is not just a continuation of those prophecies. He is the fulfillment. Jesus is what the world has been waiting for. Jesus is the Messiah that the world needs. He is the Savior that the world needs. So we want him to come back. We want him to come back and finish the restoration process. We want him to come back so we can experience the salvation of God in the fullness. And so throughout history, many people have tried to guess the date. Now, I've never dived into this type of stuff and tried to calculate the date or anything of that nature, or really explore how people got to their actual calculation. But one thing I do know is that if somebody has come up with an idea and says, this is when Jesus is coming back, I know he's not coming back then. Jesus says, no one knows the day or the hour. Now, and who am I, or who is any other person, to think that they can figure it out when Jesus didn't know himself? That's pretty high and mighty thinking. But the reality is we don't know when Jesus is going to come back, which means we need to focus on the mission that Jesus has given us. We need to stay faithful to the calling that Jesus has given us now. We must always be ready. But one of the things about it is we can't control it either. That's a little difficult for us to come to grips with in our world today. We can't control it. We can't manipulate it. We can't manufacture it. We can't accelerate it, nor can we delay it. God has planned when Jesus is going to return, and there's nothing we can do about it except being ready. And there's a difference between guessing the date and being ready. We have to be ready for Jesus. And he continues on in verse 37. He says, when the Son of Man returns, it will be like it was in Noah's day. Before the flood, the people were enjoying banquets and parties and weddings up until the time Noah entered the boat. People didn't realize what was going to happen until the flood came and swept them away. That is the way it will be when the Son of Man comes. 2 men will be working together in a field. One will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding flour at the mill. One will be taken and the other left. So as Jesus gives this illustration, talking about the flood and the work that we do, we can think about the flood that starts in Genesis chapter 6 with Noah's story, how there's a time where it wasn't raining, and then there's a time where it was. There's a time when the boat door was open, and there's a time when it was shut. And you remember the story that God actually shut the door. There's a time where they could go in, there's a time where they couldn't. But what Jesus is getting at here is, as this is happening, as the Noah story is unfolding, people in the world were living their normal lives. They were going to work, they were having parties, they were having get-togethers, they were doing their normal thing, and then all of a sudden it was too late. All of a sudden the flood came. And in this, Jesus is giving us a warning of, don't pay attention to what's happening. Don't pay attention to the signs. Just be ready. Don't look to see if there are clouds in the sky. Make sure you're on the boat. Make sure you are ready. And as he uses the workers in the field and the grinding flour at the mill, what he's getting at there is that you're not going to be saved by proximity. Just because you're close to someone who's ready doesn't mean you're ready. And this is especially poignant for us in the church. Just because you're attending a worship service doesn't mean you're ready. Just because you're around those that are ready doesn't mean that you are ready. And remember, Jesus is ushering in the kingdom of heaven, the realized eschatology. The end is here. We can live in it now, so we have no excuse. He has called us to experience his redemption, his redemptive purposes, his redemptive plan in this world with understanding that there is more to come, which means we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to live in this reality of the kingdom of heaven, but we also have a responsibility to make sure we share it with others. Because our goal as a follower of Jesus is not just to escape hard times. Our goal is not to live a comfortable life. It's to make sure other people hear about Jesus, to glorify Jesus with our life, to use the resources that God has given us for his purposes. So we as the church endure the present age so that others can begin to experience the reality of Jesus' forgiveness. But one of the warnings with this, Jesus talked about there's 2 workers in the field. One we taken, the other left. Those that are ready and those that are not, in many ways, are indistinguishable. That we can't tell the difference. I can't tell if you're ready or not. Now, Jesus can. He's the judge, as we've already established. So we have to make sure we are constantly vigilant to be ready for Jesus. And he continues, says, so you too must keep watch, for you don't know the day or the hour when your Lord is coming. Understand this. If a homeowner knew exactly when a burglar was coming, he would keep watch and prevent his house from being broken into. You also must be ready at all times, for the Son of Man will come when least expected. Now, some of you may have security systems installed in your home. And maybe it's something intense where every window can trip an alarm, or you have a camera or 2, or a video doorbell or something. But you know what? Those things don't always work. Sometimes they malfunction. Sometimes the batteries run out or the power is cut. But also, and I have no idea how to do this, supposedly people can hack security systems and get around it. I have no idea how they do that, but security systems fail. They're not foolproof. There's times where they do not work. And Jesus is telling us about the homeowner. That the burglar comes when you don't expect it. He comes in a time that he won't get caught. In a time that is convenient for him and usually inconvenient for you. And as Jesus is talking about the homeowner, I get this image of cramming for a test. A lot of people have this mentality of, well, I'll get right with Jesus later. Or I'll get my act together once this happens or once I accomplish this goal. Some of you probably get a little queasy thinking about the test that you used to take in high school or whenever it was, of having to cram for this test. And I don't even understand why do they have finals? That's just hey, let's give you 8 classes for the whole semester. Then we're going to give you a really big test on the same day for all 8 classes. But whatever. I survived. I shouldn't complain about it anymore, I guess. But the reality is, I remember those times of you stay up late and you try to write that final paper, or you study and study and study just so you were as prepared as you could be for the test. And then the test came and it was over. Well, being ready for Jesus is not like cramming for a test. It's being ready the whole semester, I guess, if we use the school analogy. And there's a big difference between knowing everything at the end and being ready the entire time. See, the Gospel of Matthew is showing us that the end times are both imminent and could be a long time. It's right now, but it could be delayed. And I think it could be safe to say that it's been a long time. It's been almost 2,000 years. That's a long time. But yet the call is now. It's immediate. And it reminds us that there's a difference between being ready and getting the date right. But Jesus continues in chapter 24. He says, a faithful, sensible servant is one to whom the master can put responsible over all other servants. If the master returns and finds the servant has done a good job, he will be rewarded. He will put the servant in charge of everything he owns. But what if the servant is evil and thinks, my master won't be back for a while? And he begins beating the other servants, partying and getting drunk. The master will return unannounced and unexpected. He will cut a servant into pieces and assign him to a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The faithful serves with integrity at all times. The faithful has committed to the master. Actually, the faithful works for the best interests of the master. Your calling as a follower of Jesus is not to follow Jesus when it's convenient. It's to follow Jesus at all times, regardless of the circumstances. Now, there are times we fail, there are times we're imperfect, and I'm not trying to be overly critical, but we also shouldn't just give us a pass. Well, I'm imperfect, so that is what it is. Jesus has called us to submit ourselves to Him. Now, the Jews, where Jesus was brought up, had the concept of the end times and all those types of things, but Jesus began to transform this understanding and bring greater wisdom to it. And so the early church begin to take off like gangbusters, begin to grow and rapidly spread. And throughout the first few centuries, the church experienced a great deal of persecution. In fact, throughout all history, there have been places where the church has endured great persecution, where death and imprisonment were real dangers of followers of Jesus. And so you think of those who heard Jesus speak these words personally, and Jesus saying He's going to come back and He's going to restore all things and take care of all that. So they are being ready, but they are longing to be freed from this persecution, from this difficulty in life. They're longing that Jesus would return. But what Matthew reminds us is that life continues. Until Jesus returns, we've got work to do. Until Jesus returns, we may have to endure difficult circumstances. Until Jesus returns, we need to stay focused and faithful on the Master. But the fact that the timing is unknown on many levels increases the meaning and significance. If we knew Jesus was going to come back on this particular time, we'd all probably be pretty lackadaisical until it got real close to that time. Then we cram for the test. But because we don't know if Jesus is going to come back tomorrow or in another 1,000 years, we've got work to do now. The calling is immediate. There's urgency with what we're supposed to do. Now, the master rewards the faithful. The faithful servant who does what the master asks and has the master's best interest in mind will be rewarded. And I love the concept of the reward for a job well done is there's more work to do. You are never retired from serving Jesus. No matter how old you get, if you've got breath in your lungs, you are not retired from serving Jesus. Your work is never done. So don't get caught up in waiting for Jesus because there's work to do here and now. But distractions are all around us. Distractions continue to arise within us. And what I would say is that in the last 2 years, I'm guessing each and every one of you got distracted. Because I know I did. And when I say distracted, I don't mean that you went off on the deep end or something of that nature, but we took our eyes off Jesus, at least just a little bit. And if you didn't in the last 2 years, you need to write a book or something. Because the last 2 years have been about as distracting as we can possibly get. The last 2 years have been very difficult for us, but no matter how difficult it is, Jesus still says we are to work for the interest of the Master. We are to keep our eyes fixed upon Him. We are to be ready, constantly vigilant, not in a way that gives us anxiety, but in a way that gives us excitement to usher in the reality of the kingdom of heaven. That is what He's called us to do. So whether Jesus comes back tomorrow or in 1,000 years, we are ready because we're living in the kingdom now. But those who are unfaithful don't necessarily have a great outcome. Those who abuse or neglect what the Master has called them to do will be punished accordingly. And the Master will separate the faithful from the unfaithful. Now, Matthew chapter 24 and 25 speak about the end times. And in these chapters, Jesus gives several illustrations or parables about what will happen. He talks about the workers in the field. One will be taken, one will be left. Being close to somebody who's ready doesn't mean that you are ready. He talks about the homeowner and the burglar. Being ready for Jesus is not about cramming for a test. It's about living for Jesus now. He talks about the faithful and the unfaithful servant. We have to have the Master's best interest in mind. It's not about you. It's not about accumulating wealth. It's not about attaining health or prosperity or certain standing in the world. It's about Jesus. And then we get to Matthew 25. He talks about the parable of the 10 virgins. Remember, there were 5 that didn't take any extra oil, 5 that took extra oil. And when the bridegroom came, the ones that had the extra oil were ready and could go in, and the other 5 were pushed out. They were not allowed in because they weren't ready. Now, one of the things about that story that I really like is all 10 were asleep when the bridegroom came. So being ready for Jesus is not about getting the date right. It's about preparing. It's about having what we need when He comes. Then Jesus talks about the parable of the talents, that God gives us resources, and that when we use them for His glory, He will reward us. And the one who is condemned is the one who will not try. Then He talks about the parable of the sheep and the goats, where He says, what you did for the least of these, you did for me. It's about serving others without expecting anything in return. It's about serving others in the name of Jesus. Jesus has called us to live our normal lives as though He's coming back. He's invited us to live our normal lives as though we can enter the reality of the kingdom of heaven now. But I fear there are times we've gotten distracted. I fear there are times that we've taken our eyes off Jesus. Because what Jesus is trying to do is to reconcile us to God, to allow us to walk with God again. Walking with God as a friend. Walking with God as He is our own. And He gives of Himself to us. Not in a way that we own God, but that God reveals Himself to us.